we're going to start off doing some math and then some comparisons, or some multiple choice questions, excuse me. So first we want to find the monopolist equilibrium. So monopolists look for where marginal revenue intersects their marginal cost. So we have marginal cost, it's 10 plus 3q. We don't have marginal revenue, but we do have demand. So in the notes, you learned that the demand and marginal revenue are related in that they have the same intercept, so in this case 150. The only difference is that number in front of 2 in Q needs to be twice as much. So that -2 becomes -4. And now we're ready to solve for our equilibrium quantity. So if we add 4q to both sides, you get 150 equals 10 plus 7q. Subtract 10, you get 140 equals 7q. Divide by 7, and you get that the quantity is 20. So if we were to sketch out demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, we have found that the monopolist is going to want to produce 20. Then to get the price, we need to go back up to the demand curve. So we can't plug it in either of those equations we have written under number 1. You need to go back to the original demand curve. So that's 150 minus 2 times the quantity of 20. So that's 150 minus 40, which is 110. So the price is $110. Okay, so make sure you go back up to the demand curve when you're finding that one. Then if we wanted to find what the competitive equilibrium would be, using these same equations, that means now we set the price equal to the marginal cost. So our demand equation, 150 minus 2q, is equal to 10 plus 3q. So solving by adding 2q to both sides becomes 10 plus 5q over there. Then subtracting 10 gives us 140 equals 5q. 140 divided by 5. 140 divided by 5 is 28. So our new quantity is 28, which based on our graph, we should have gotten something more than 20, and we did. So that's a good sign. And our price, now you could plug it back in either the demand or the marginal cost curve. To keep things simple, I'm going to plug it back into the demand curves so that we're always plugging it in the same one. So that's 150 minus 56, which is 94. If in the first one you had plugged it back in the wrong equation, you would have gotten that the monopoly would charge a lower price than the perfectly competitive firm. Not only is that not realistic, it's not accurate. So let's see what our different areas look like. So back to the monopolists. This line represents how much they can sell it for, whereas this one represents, down at the bottom, how much it costs them. So the difference between the two is the producer surplus. Then if we look at the difference between what people would be willing to pay and what they have to pay, this triangle up here is the consumer surplus. Now if we look after or compared to the competitive equilibrium, this is how much people pay, this is how much it costs, and so producer surplus is there in that dark blue. And then consumer surplus is the amount people pay, so it's that triangle up there. So, and then total is those two together. So if we're comparing, our producer surplus is higher. Well, actually, I take that back. Excuse me. So when you're looking at the monopoly versus the perfect competition, there's this rectangle here that a monopoly has, but there's this triangle here that perfectly competitive firms have. So it's not exactly clear which one results in a higher one based on the picture. However, because they could pick any possible point on the demand curve, it must be the case that the producer surplus is better off up here than it is down here, because then they would have just chosen that point. So producer surplus is higher for a monopoly. Consumer surplus, though, is very clear. It goes from the little top triangle for a monopoly to the bigger green triangle for a competitive equilibrium. So consumer surplus is lower in a monopoly situation, which is why people don't like them. Okay. Total surplus, however, is also lower. For some reason, my pen doesn't want to write, but total surplus is lower for a monopoly. And that's because of that deadweight loss, right? There's less when you combine the little green triangle with the purple trapezoid. That's a smaller area than the big green, darker green triangle with the navy one. And so because of that, total surplus is lower in a monopoly than in perfectly competitive. So now we're going to relate what we've learned back to the cost curves. So let's suppose the monopolist cost and revenue are as follows. Average total cost is $50, marginal cost is $40, marginal revenue is $40, price is $60. What should the firm do? Well, since it's a monopoly, they need to see if marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And we have that marginal revenue is 40 and marginal cost is 40. So they are equal. So that means they are at their best possible combination. So they don't want to change their output. Okay. Also, their price is $60. So every time they produce and sell an item, they get $60. And it costs them $50 to produce it on average. So the price is more than the cost. So they're essentially making $10, the difference between 60 and 50, for each unit. So that means they're making a profit. They're not going to want to shut down. And so they're not going to want to change their output or their price. They're doing the best they can possibly do output-wise because those two are equal, and then they're making profits because the price is greater than the average total cost. And this last one, we're saying this is what's happening, so it must be on the demand curve. So that's just an attempt to get a fifth option in there. Our answer is A. In this question, we're going to compare what happens when a perfectly competitive firm tries to sell an additional unit versus when a monopolist does. So for perfect competition, their price is constant, right? They have to take the marginal revenue price from the equilibrium in the market. They can't change it. It's constant no matter what. And so because of that, if they increase their quantity, then their price stays the same, which means their total revenue, which is price times quantity, goes up because quantity is rising. For a monopolist, price is not constant, right? They can pick whatever they want. And as their quantity rises, their marginal revenue falls. Right? It's a decreasing line. It has a downward slope back in the picture. And so what's happening to total revenue is that it goes up for a little bit and then goes down. Okay, so if a perfect competition wants to sell additional unit, let's look at our options. Total revenues always rise. That's true. Total revenues do not remain unchanged. Marginal revenue stays the same. Total revenues always rise. Okay, so those are all possible. Because over here when I said price is their marginal revenue. What they get for selling in one more unit is just whatever the market price is. It doesn't change whether they sell 1 or 50. They get whatever the price is in a perfectly competitive firm. So for a monopolist, our first one says total revenues could go up or down or stay the same. That's true. We've already eliminated B. C says marginal revenues rise. That's not true. Marginal revenue is downward sloping, so when quantity goes up, it goes down. And total revenues do not always fall. They can fall, but it's not always. So A is the one that gives us the correct combination. This question starts out by saying use this information for questions 3 through 5. A couple years ago, I removed question 4 and 5, but I haven't renumbered the document, so I apologize for that. There is no 4 and 5. It just goes straight from 3 to 6. So, our scenario. Suppose a federal judge has declared that Microsoft is a monopoly, and thus a price searcher in the sense that we use the term in a class. We're also going to suppose that the judge is correct in this declaration, that Microsoft is indeed a monopoly. Further assume that Microsoft is operating at an optimum level of production. So which of the following must be true? A, Microsoft is operating where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, if they are producing at the optimum level of production, that has to be the case. So A is true. Microsoft's profits are higher than it would be if it operated at price equals marginal cost. So that's just saying, as a monopoly, it makes more than a perfectly competitive firm with the same demand and cost structure would make. Also true. Right, their producer surplus is higher. Microsoft profits per dollars of sale are higher than the per dollar of sales of the average American corporation. While that could be true, it's not necessarily a given with the information. A monopoly that's tiny and therefore doesn't make much is not necessarily the situation. So not only do we not have enough information to conclusively say something like that, it might not even be true. The only thing we have enough information to say is both A and B. In this question, we need to compare what two different markets look like. So first, we're going to draw the perfectly competitive market, what that firm specifically looks like. So they have some demand, right? People only pay whatever the market price is and marginal cost. Their demand is the same as their marginal revenue, and so they're going to produce this many, and this is the price. If we're looking at a monopoly, so this again is just the firm, it's just in this instant, the firm is the whole market. So the demand is downward sloping. The marginal revenue starts at the same place, so falls to twice the rate. Marginal cost is there. So that's how many they would produce. And they're going to charge a price up here, whereas their marginal revenue is down here. But here, they're in a perfectly competitive firm, their price and their marginal revenue is the same. So the scenario tells us they're both selling their item at $5. So this is $5 and this is $5. A says the marginal revenue is $5 for the perfectly competitive firm. So if we look in our perfectly competitive firm, we see that marginal revenue is $5. That's true. And marginal revenue is more than $5 for the monopolist. But here we see, here's our 5, and there's our marginal revenue. So 5 is higher than the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue is not higher than 5. So that's not correct. B says marginal revenue is less than 5 for both firms. It is 5 for the perfectly competitive firm, and it's not 5 for the monopoly. So again, the next one's not true. Both firms are earning 0 profits. We don't know. right? It is impossible to know what their profits are because there is zero information about the costs. If we knew that at this unit of output what their average total cost was, we'd be able to tell, but we don't know that for sure. And then E says marginal revenue is $5 for the competitive firm. That's true. And marginal revenue is less than $5 for the monopoly. That is also true. So our answer here is E. So here we have a snapshot of the total revenue for a firm at different levels of output. If we want to figure out if someone is a price taker or a price searcher, your best thing to do is to look at the marginal revenue. Because for a price taker or a perfectly competitive firm, they have a constant marginal revenue. So we would get the same one no matter the level of production. Whereas for a price searcher or a monopolist, you would see that their marginal revenue goes down as they produce more. So let's look here at our table. So it tells us that they collect $100 in total revenue when it sells 4 units, $130 when it sells 5, and $150 when it sells 6. So since we don't know what happens at 3, we can't figure out the marginal revenue from adding a fourth. But from 4 to 5, we can see our total revenue goes from 100 to 130. That's a change of 30. And then from 5 to 6, 130 to 150. That's a change of 20. So we see that these two numbers are not the same. They're not equal. And so because of that, it must not be a price taker. So that is not our answer. B says it's facing an upward sloping demand curve. Not only is that not the case, that's not possible. Demand is downward sloping. They are indeed a price searcher because their marginal revenue is changing. D says not maximizing profits. This isn't talking about where they're producing, it's just talking about their options. So also there's nothing in here about costs. So we couldn't even know what their profits look like without costs. E says earning the highest profit when it sells 6 units. It's the highest total revenue, but again, without costs, we can't tell what's happening to profit. So the only thing we know for sure that this must be a price searcher of some kind.